We're seeing that cyberspace is emerging as a domain of conflict, and we feel that the industry, which is responsible for the domain, needs to be as much as possible involved in the political discussions that are happening, especially at the UN level.
We've seen Ukraine as a test bed for cyber attacks for a number of years, and disproportionately so. We reported that attacks within Ukraine constituted almost 1/5 of all the attacks that we observed across the world. And that's why we and the government of Ukraine remain very concerned about the cybersecurity risk of the current conflict and tensions within Ukraine.
Welcome to Patching the System, a special podcast for the Global Stage series, a partnership between GZERO Media and Microsoft. I'm your host, Ali Wine, a senior analyst at Eurasia Group. Over the course of 5 episodes, we're going to tackle some of the biggest risks and challenges in cyberspace today. Topics like conflict between nations in cyberspace, cybercrime, and protecting the Internet of Things. Throughout this series, we'll hear from expert voices and leaders from technology firms that have signed on to the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, a public commitment from more than 150 global technology companies dedicated to creating a safer cyber world for all of us. Later in the show, we'll hear from the Tech Accord's head of the Secretariat, Annalaura Gallo. But first, it could happen to any of us. You wake up, you click a link in an email, and bam, your computer becomes completely inoperable. Now, most people know what malware is, and they know the kinds of headaches it can cause for individual users. Well, it's increasingly being used by governments for espionage and even for hybrid warfare. Ukraine is facing hybrid threats, including a widespread malware attack that targeted government and private systems. Microsoft and other technology organizations have been working to detect and identify how malware is being used strategically in the region. For more on that, we're joined by Tom Burt, Microsoft's Corporate Vice President for Customer Security and Trust. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ali. Thanks for having me.
No, our pleasure. So Tom, just to kick things off, so Microsoft recently called out malware that it discovered in Ukraine. It was targeting government agencies. And in the past year, you've called out a number of state-sponsored attacks, including the SolarWinds hack, the Microsoft Exchange attack. Tell us, how dangerous are these attacks, and what are nation-state actors really after?
Well, the attacks that you mentioned are a great illustration of the breadth of different kinds of nation-state attacks that we are seeing. SolarWinds, as an example, was a very sophisticated espionage attack, where the goal was to infiltrate key targets and steal information of interest to the attackers. In the Hafnium attacks, as we called them, that was the name of the activity group, but the attacks, widespread attacks against on-premises Exchange servers, we actually were never able to determine what the end goal of the nation-state actor was in that case, because although they got tens of thousands of web shells installed around the globe on these Exchange servers, there was very little evidence that those web shell backdoors were ever actually used by the attacker. The activity we've seen in Ukraine in recent weeks have covered both of those kinds of efforts. So malware that we call Whispergate installed on the servers of a wide range of government, nonprofit, and other organizations within Ukraine. It was masquerading as ransomware, but behind the scenes, it wasn't ransomware at all. It was a wiper that was working to wipe off the data that was on those machines to basically render them inoperable. So it was a destructive attack. Since then, we've actually again issued a blog about activity that we've seen in Ukraine from a group we call Actinium. At Microsoft, we use these element names to identify different nation-state actors. That's a group that we see operating from the Crimea region that we and others have studied for some time. And we saw them very active in engaging what looked like more traditional espionage kinds of activities. So you see this broad range of nation-state activity, things like the NotPetya attack in 2017 in the Ukraine, which was a very destructive attack that targeted a wide range of organizations and had significant impacts on the citizens of Ukraine, but also extended to outside Ukraine to multinational companies doing business in Ukraine that were virtually shut down. The world's leading shipping company, Maersk, was almost completely shut down as a result of that attack for some period of time.
And so you talked a lot about, you already in your answer, you covered a wide range of attacks, and you talked about some of these blog posts discussing various attacks. So it sounds like Microsoft, it also plays a role in attributing these attacks as well.
Yes, our Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, which we refer to as MYSTIC, is a group of highly talented cyber sleuths who are constantly looking at anomalous activity that we see on the internet, and especially tracking the activity of known groups that we have determined over a number of years of observation. We've been able to assign activity to those groups based on the character of the way they operate in conducting their attacks and in considering the analysis done by other cybersecurity researchers. And we take all that together to determine that a particular activity group is responsible for a particular attack. At Microsoft, we do not typically assign attribution to government operators. We don't have the data to tell us who is in control of these activity groups, but we can and often do assign a zone of operation so that we will know from convincing evidence that the activity group is operating from a particular region or a particular country.
So we've been talking a little bit about sort of Russia, Ukraine. Obviously, it is the sort of the urgent security crisis dominating the agenda of policymakers and analysts across the world. But let's sort of open up the aperture a little bit. Take us a little bit beyond Russia, Ukraine. Tell us about the global threat landscape and a little bit more about what we should be keeping our eyes for about these attacks going forward.
Well, there has been a remarkable escalation in the number and the sophistication of attacks. And I'm using the term attack to cover both nation-state operations, both espionage and destructive operations, but also cybercrime attacks. And what we're seeing is increasing connections between the cyber criminal world and the nation-state world. We see nation-state actors using technology developed by cyber criminals, such as ransomware, in nation-state attacks. So we have written about nation-state attacks where we've seen ransomware used to target critical infrastructure or government operations in various locations around the world. And we've also seen, in a number of instances, nation-state attackers using ransomware as the cover for a different destructive attack, such as the one that we just talked about in Ukraine. We see cyber criminals using technologies developed by nation-state attackers. When nation-state attackers learn of and develop technology to exploit a so-called zero-day vulnerability in someone's technology, then we see cyber criminals as fast followers. As soon as they learn of that vulnerability, they then start to take advantage of it as well. And because the ecosystem as a whole is slow to patch their technologies, the vendors, Microsoft, the leading technology vendors around the world, all quickly research any of these vulnerabilities that are disclosed and provide patches for their technologies to protect customers. But customers have to apply those patches. And that happens at a surprisingly low rate because it can be burdensome to do it. It's just, it's a cyber hygiene thing that the organization isn't budgeted or staffed to do. And as a result, you see cyber criminals taking advantages of these vulnerabilities that have long since been patched by the vendors, but customers haven't applied the patches. So you have a wide range of these different kinds of attacks, and they continue to grow in sophistication. They continue to escalate around the world. In the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, we continue to see increasing numbers, more and more participants, and we see most of the nation-state activity emanating from 4 key countries: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. We recently saw a significant increase in the total volume of attacks coming from Russian-based actors and Iranian-based actors as they used password spray, which was a high-volume attack with a low percentage of success, but they don't care that the success rate is low because it's an inexpensive way to engage in broad scale attacks. As a result, there's just more that we need to do both in the private sector, the public sector in partnership with the private sector, and we need the ecosystem broadly, the users of systems to know what they need to do to apply cyber hygiene to protect themselves. But to take it back to current events just for a moment, notwithstanding this huge escalation, we've seen the Ukraine as a test bed for cyber attacks for a number of years, and disproportionately so. In our most recent data that I referred to in the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, we reported that attacks within Ukraine constituted almost 1/5 of all the attacks that we observed across the world. So a very disproportionate percentage of attacks. And that's why we and the government of Ukraine remain very concerned about the cybersecurity risk of the current conflict and tensions within Ukraine.
That 1/5 figure that you just cited, I hadn't heard of that. I mean, it's a staggering figure, and to imagine that just 1/5 is associated with one country or with one conflict, it's really quite a striking proportion. I want to sort of expand our conversation a little bit, and we're going to talk about what the tech industry globally can do to help foster greater stability and structure in cyberspace. And Tom, in your answers this morning, you've already given some flavor of what Microsoft has been doing to help foster that greater stability and structure in cyberspace. I want to bring in another guest, Annalaura Gallo, who is the head of the Secretariat of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, to help flesh out the conversation. Annalaura, welcome.
Hi, Ali. Thanks for having me here.
Annalaura, so first explain to listeners, obviously the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, it's a major undertaking, but perhaps some of our listeners, they might not be familiar with it. So just give us kind of the 101. What is this Tech Accord and what is it set out to accomplish?
So the Cybersecurity Tech Accord is a coalition of over 150 technology companies, and it serves as the voice of this industry on matters of peace and security in cyberspace. So we're seeing that cyberspace is emerging as a domain of conflict, and we feel that the industry, which is responsible for the domain, needs to be as much as possible involved in the political discussions that are happening, especially at the UN level. So we have been engaging with the UN and with governments in order to contribute our perspective and our expertise. The Tech Accord mission revolves around 4 principles. So when companies want to become signatories, they want to abide by these principles. And the first is about protecting users and customers everywhere, irrespective of their technical acumen or the culture or the motive of the malicious attack that is targeting them. And we do this by delivering and designing products that are secure. We're also committed to not knowingly undermine the security of the online environment. And we do so by protecting against efforts also by governments to tamper with our products and services. We also strongly believe in the importance of capacity building, so we help governments and other actors, and also raising awareness about cyber risks and ways to mitigate them. And we truly believe that no organization can solve today's cybersecurity challenges alone. And finally, we are all for collective response. So we think we can achieve more together, and we're partnering up and we'll partner up with other entities and groups to address critical cybersecurity challenges.
Something you just said near the end of your response, I think it aligns really nicely with something that Tom said, this notion of collective response. Tom talked about the imperative of governments working hand in hand with businesses, with actors in the private sector, the imperative of a collective response to keep pace with these growing threats. And you also mentioned that collective response kind of is one of the pillars of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. So we've been talking a little bit today about some of these large-scale cyber attacks, such as the one that we just saw in Ukraine that Tom discussed. How big a concern are those kinds of attacks for the Accord, and what are some of the concrete steps that you think can be taken to prevent them from occurring in the future?
The attacks that we're seeing in Ukraine are a good example of how cyber conflict is becoming increasingly part of conflict between states. And as such, it needs clear boundaries and rules, similar to other domains of air, land, sea, space. And it's important to remember that these attacks do not occur in a complete legal vacuum, even if most of them don't reach the threshold of the use of force and therefore cannot trigger responses that military operations would. But states have agreed that international law applies to cyberspace, and we should operate in this framework. The Tech Accord has been engaging with the UN, especially in the context of the dialogues on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And what we've done is really encouraging states to further develop their framework of norms that guide states' operations in cyberspace, and also to try and clarify how, in their view, international law applies to cyberspace, because it needs to be much more detailed, the framework, in order to be put in action more easily. But we're also looking at this from the angle of the increasing the security of products and services, so promoting practices such as cyber hygiene, because this would help prevent the vast majority of cyber attacks. We've been focusing a lot on the Internet of Things, for instance, because we see that these technologies are increasingly targeted by cyber attackers, and once they've been compromised, they couldn't be used to conduct cyber attacks of a larger scale. So we're looking at this from different angles, and we hope to be able to continue to support governments and other actors and provide recommendations on how these threats can be mitigated.
Tom, I want to bring you back in the conversation now that you've heard as well a little bit about kind of Annalaura's thinking about the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. And of course, Microsoft is one of the signatories, one of the more than 150 signatories to the Accord. In your earlier response, you talked about the imperative of collective response. But I want to zoom in on the private sector and the role of the private sector in that collective response. So Tom, what do you see as the role of private technology companies in both defending against the kinds of attacks that we've been talking about, but also finding security solutions going forward?
There's a number of things that the private sector needs to continue to improve on and which we're investing in heavily at Microsoft. But let me begin with the requirement that we engage in the best possible security engineering practices. And we at Microsoft pioneered the concept of secure development lifecycle in our engineering practices a number of years ago when we saw the beginnings of this increase in both cyber criminal and nation state attacks. And we continue to evolve those principles and to automate those principles to improve the security of our technologies. And across the private sector, that needs to continue to be a focus. We also need to continue to detect when we see these attacks occurring and to improve our technology so that we can observe that activity, perhaps even before it has had impact and has harmed our customers, so that we can notify customers and they can take steps to protect themselves. And that is something that we're rapidly evolving across the private sector. Here at Microsoft alone, we get 24 trillion signals a day that come in from our network on our ecosystem. And that gives our defender teams this wealth of data from which they can look for anomalous activity in the internet and then zoom in on that activity to see if it's a malign activity by a nation state actor or a cyber criminal. And we continue to work on developing artificial intelligence technologies that will be able to do this rapidly enough that we can perhaps find and stop this activity in an automated way. So there's a lot of investment going into what we can do to both defend and deter. But we also need to work to make it easier for our customers to defend themselves and to take the steps necessary to protect against these attacks. And that's something that we've been working on. I know the Tech Accord has been very engaged on as well, which is just spreading the word of the critical importance of basic cyber hygiene. We published a blog from our identity team 3 years ago now, in which our analysis was that 99.8% of all attacks would have been prevented if the victim had had multi-factor authentication installed on their account. And that remains the number one best defense. It's not a perfect defense, but it's the most significant thing that people can do is to make sure that all of your accounts have two-factor or multi-factor authentication or passwordless identity or some similar system that would significantly defend against the principal means of cyber attacks, which are phishing and other identity-related attacks. And then there are other basic cybersecurity hygiene steps that have to be taken that we need to continue to make easier and spread the word. People need to patch their systems. Those who administer networks need to use zero trust architecture within their networks. And these are techniques that are well understood. There's lots of information out there about them. But if we're really going to stop these cyber attacks and significantly decrease the number and impact of cybercrime and nation state attacks, basic cybersecurity hygiene will go a long way. And the last thing, in which there's heavy investment across the private sector, is moving to the cloud. Because it's in the cloud where all vendors, Microsoft and all our cloud competitors, are investing our most resources and most innovation on how we can improve the cybersecurity of the cloud. And it's just obvious. Within the cloud, we can keep everybody patched. Within the cloud, we can utilize very modern versions of identity to ensure that some of these cyber attacks cannot be launched. And so it's there that we can provide all consumers with the best possible security, and that's going to continue to be true for many years. The last part is to continue to do the work that we're working on, that the Tech Accord has been very engaged on, which is working across international efforts to create enforceable rules governing nation-state conduct in cyberspace. And this is a critical step that we've made a lot of progress over the last several years, but we have a very long way to go. And those norms of conduct should apply both to nation-state actors that are government-sponsored actors, but also to cyber criminals that are known to be operating from a particular geography. Nations need to do more to identify and take action against those cyber criminal operators. And these are principles that are being discussed through important multi-stakeholder processes like the Paris Call, where both the Tech Accord and Microsoft and many others have been very active in the key principles of the Paris Call and in the follow-up working groups that have been conducted, and also in the processes before the United Nations. The process, the Oxford process, which is where a number of the world's leading legal experts have been convening to address the application of international law in cyberspace. So there are a number of these efforts underway in which we need more private sector engagement so that the policymakers of the world have the perspective of the private sector. Frankly, it's been one of the greatest contributions of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord is to have this very broad, multinational, as you mentioned, 150 different technology companies joining together to form consensus views on these key cybersecurity principles.
Two numbers from your answer, jumped out. So the first one made me feel a little bit pessimistic. The second one made me feel a little bit better. So you said that every 24 hours, Microsoft is processing approximately 24 trillion security signals. And that kind of makes you think, my goodness, how are we going to get a handle on this problem when you're processing such a torrent of data? But then you said 99.8, so almost 100% of cyber attacks that users experience on a day-to-day basis could be mitigated or maybe even prevented by just taking basic precautionary measures such as sort of two-factor authentication. And so, Annalaura, when you hear those two numbers, sort of the 24 trillion security signals that Microsoft is processing every 24 hours, but also the reality that close to 100% of cyber attacks that folks are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, they can be remedied by just taking basic precautions. Do you think that cyber threats are just the new normal, and should we just expect further escalation going forward? Or are there plausible pathways where we could actually see a reduction in these cyber threats?
So cyber attacks are unfortunately increasingly common, but at the same time, we cannot allow this to become the new normal because it would jeopardize the benefits that digital technology brings. And we've seen how much of an enabler technology has been during the pandemic as well. First of all, we need to be always vigilant when we use technology products and services, but this changing threat environment also means that there are greatest responsibilities for all stakeholders involved, for the industry to develop and maintain more secure products, but also for governments to pursue responsible regulation, and as we said before, to uphold expectations on the limit of their actions in cyberspace. And finally, also for consumers that use technology in order for them to do it more responsibly. And there also needs to be greater collaboration across sectors, because we have seen that cyber attacks do not spare any type of organization and sector, but they actually target the ones that are most vulnerable. In terms of further escalation, we're definitely seeing an increase of these attacks, and we look into organization concerns a little bit further in 2020 by launching a survey in partnership with the Economist Intelligence Unit. And what we found is that organizations from all sectors are very concerned about the increase in cyber attacks, and in particular cyber attacks that are coming from state actors. They also responded that this concern had increased in the past 5 years, and that they would see these tensions as continuing, and that their organizations could be the target also over the next years. But there was also an important call to action for governments really to take control of the situation and to try and find political solutions to mitigate these threats. So not only technical solution, but also going back to the framework of international norms. And we hope that we can build on this call to action, because this is what, in our view, can stop further escalation.
So, Tom, you heard what Annalaura said right now. I think a cautiously optimistic view that there are steps that governments can take, that the private sector can take, the technology companies can take, but also recognizing that we are facing an escalating cyber threat landscape. So how do we begin to confront that reality, and what role do you see Microsoft as playing in confronting this new reality of escalating cyber challenges or cyber threats?
I think Microsoft's role is to continue to work across as many domains as we can to raise the visibility of these challenges, and to work across the private sector and the public sector and all interested parties to develop solutions to these challenges. I agree completely with Annalaura that this cannot be considered a new normal. We all, the private sector, the citizens, the customers, government officials, policymakers, none of us can accept that this degree of cyber attack and cyber crime can be considered a new normal. We simply shouldn't tolerate it. It will create a world in which the benefits that the internet can bring to us all, the economic benefits, but also art and collaboration and communication and education across all of these different dimensions, the internet can bring great benefit, but not if there is associated great risk. So we have to confront this. We're doing that in a number of ways. First, we are working actively, as I mentioned, with multi-stakeholder groups like the Paris Call, by being a supporter of the work of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, through our own engagements with policymakers and government leaders, with the United Nations processes and seeking to get a multi-stakeholder voice in those processes, and working with leading governments around the world as they formulate cybersecurity policy. All of these are steps that we need to take to confront this challenge. We also need to continue to make it easier for our customers to apply those basic cybersecurity hygiene practices. And we need to continue to work together across the private sector on how we can collaborate to better defend against these attacks and help our customers respond when they do occur. I do want to clarify one thing just for your listeners. The 24 trillion signals we get a day, and this will lift your pessimism maybe just a bit. Those are not all cybersecurity signals. That's the total number of signals we get from all activity across our ecosystem.
Got it.
The positive part about that, though, is it's that kind of data that enables the application of the kind of investigations we're doing now and the innovation that we are bringing to bear to that data to help us rapidly detect and respond to, to threats that we see through anomalous activity in the internet. So as we can build better technologies to take that data and look for things that shouldn't be there, and then respond quickly to notify targets to actually block that activity automatically through technology. These are all things that should give us optimism that we can build a safer internet, and the private sector needs to work hard together with the public sector and civic society to build a safer internet to start with. But we also need those enforceable rules of nation state conduct as norms that are widely observed across the world to really get us to a place where the the full benefit of the internet can be realized by everyone in every region of the world.
Tom, thank you so much for clarifying the 24 trillion number. It does make me feel a little bit better. Annalaura, I want to give you the last word. We've been talking about a number of different kinds of cyber attacks, but beyond the kinds of attacks we've been discussing, what do you see as the most pressing issues for the cyber world right now and going forward?
So the most pressing issue that we see is the generally escalating threat environment. So we see more sophisticated and damaging attacks, but we also see more of them overall. A growing threat surface, meaning more entry points for attackers to exploit, and also a growing numbers of malicious actors that are driving the proliferation, not only criminal organizations, but as we said, also governments, and also the so-called cyber mercenaries, which are private companies that develop cyber surveillance tools and then sell them to foreign governments and other customers. And what we think is urgently needed is a greater recognition of this challenge, but also an approach by the international community that can really meet the scale of this challenge. And this means continuing the dialogues on responsible state behavior in cyberspace, further developing the framework of norms, understanding what are the responsibilities of states in cyberspace, but also ensuring that these dialogues become more inclusive on non-governmental stakeholders, especially the one at the UN. And the UN has a very long history of multi-stakeholder inclusion that in many cases has made the political solutions to many problems having more legitimacy. And last year, to highlight this even more, we published a study in the context of our work with the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, where we really made a case for this greater inclusivity of these dialogues. And this means inclusion not only of the industry, but also of academia and civil society. So all the relevant stakeholders that have expertise and that can really contribute their input, especially considering that cyberspace is a very complex area where the responsibility of all stakeholders overlap. So what we think should happen is that these dialogues should become more inclusive, and this means this inclusivity should be a bit more structured. For instance, that there are channels for non-governmental stakeholders to provide input, but also that our inclusions become a little bit more regular, and this has not been the case in the past. And we think that this could really deliver solutions that are fit for purpose and that can meet the challenges that we're facing today.
Annalaura Gallo, head of the Secretariat of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, Tom Burt, Corporate Vice President of Customer Security and Trust at Microsoft. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for this episode of Patching the System. In the coming weeks, we'll tackle everything from cyber mercenaries, which you just heard about, to the Internet of Things. And you can catch this podcast as a special drop in Ian Bremmer's GZERO World feed anywhere you get your podcasts. I'm Ali Wine. Thanks so much for listening.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.